Welcome back to MindWaves, the official podcast of NYNO. In each episode, we explore the science of the brain and mental health through conversations with researchers, clinicians, and experts who are helping us better understand ourselves and the world around us.
Over the past 2 episodes, we've discussed mental health care and the brain's remarkable ability to learn and adapt. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating questions in neuroscience. What are emotions and how does the brain create them?
Emotions influence nearly every aspect of our lives. They shape our relationships, guide our decisions, affect our mental health, and help us navigate the world around us. Yet despite experiencing emotions every day, scientists are still working to understand exactly how they emerge from the brain.
To help us explore these questions, we're honored to welcome Dr. Joseph LeDoux.
Dr. LeDoux is one of the world's leading neuroscientists and has spent decades studying the brain's mechanisms involving emotion, memory, and survival. His research has transformed our understanding of fear and anxiety, and his work has helped shape modern discussions about how emotions are generated within the brain.
In today's conversation, we'll discuss the neuroscience of emotion, common misconceptions about fear and anxiety, how emotional experiences influence our lives, and what neuroscience can teach us about mental health and self-understanding. Dr. LeDoux, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're very excited to have you here. To start, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your research and what first drew you to studying emotions and the brain?
Well, I had 2 degrees in business administration, and I took a class that I thought was going to be relevant to my consumer protection efforts in the 1970s. And it turned out the class it's called Learning and Motivation, but it was not about marketing or anything like that. It was really about the brain and memory. And I kind of fell in love with that whole thing and applied to a bunch of graduate schools, and most of them rejected me because I had no credentials. But at Stony Brook, I was accepted into Long Island. I was accepted into the PhD program for some weird reason, and from there, I ended up studying what's called split brain patients. These are people in whom the 2 hemispheres are separated in an effort to control epilepsy. And what's interesting about these is how the left hemisphere has language and can talk to you, but the right hemisphere is sort of, a kind of silent partner in a way. So we were studying the consequences of these operations, not on the epilepsy so much, but just on what it meant for understanding conscious experience. And we one night we go up to New England to test these patients because they were all operated on at Dartmouth. And so in the evening, we go to the bar and have a drink and talk about, what we had done during the day. And my mentor, Michael Gazzaniga, said, there's not much work on emotion in neuroscience these days. And the light bulb went off. I said, well, that's what I want to do, because we had done one study on emotion in the split brain patient. I really was kind of drawn to that. And so I began to figure out how I was going to do that after I graduated. And I decided that I didn't want to study it in humans because the human brain, there were no good methods for studying the human brain back in those days. It was like you could take X-rays or things like that, maybe some, basically, there was no MRI or things like that. So I decided I would study emotional behavior, not emotion itself, in rats. And I got a job in a lab as a postdoc, and the professor allowed me to do whatever I wanted because he was recording blood pressure and heart rate. So he was getting his money from the NIH institute that controls the cardiovascular system. And so as long as I studied, as long as I measured blood pressure and heart rate, I could do whatever I wanted. And so I was studying how, a rat in their brain goes about the business of detecting and responding to danger. I was using Pavlovian conditioning as the method. And that led us to the part of the brain called the amygdala. I didn't go looking for the amygdala, but the research took us there. By making lesions throughout various brain areas in the auditory system, we were able to prevent Pavlovian fear conditioning from occurring. And when, for lesion, for example, the auditory thalamus down in, below the cortex, the animals couldn't be conditioned anymore. But if you lesion the cortex, it had no effect. So the question was, how did the stimulus come to control the behavior of the animal if it wasn't going through the auditory cortex? Because at that time, it was thought that the cortex was the place where anything interesting or important would go through. And so in order to get to an emotional behavior, you'd have to go through the cortex. But that just didn't turn out to be correct. The pathways, we were doing a lot of tracing, track tracing stuff to try and figure out where the auditory thalamus was going besides the auditory cortex. That took me to the amygdala. The amygdala took me to the muscles that control the behavioral responses, and the visceral organs that control the physiological responses. And so that was my starting point. And from there, I just went on to keep doing that over and over again, not over and over again, but I kept doing it in various ways, and ended up beginning to ask the question of how emotion occurs in the human brain. And that was a kind of switch, because I was studying rats, but as I said, I really was only studying rat behavior. But I would write book chapters and so forth, and on my behavioral research in rats. But I would always put a kind of part of the chapter at the end about the human brain and consciousness, and that's something I've been thinking about my entire career is consciousness. And the animal behavior stuff was just a kind of way to get the behavior going in humans and in animals, because that if you condition a human brain, the person will show physiological and behavioral responses similar to what a rat shows. So the behavioral part was the same, but obviously the rat can't have the kind of conscious experience of the emotion that we do. And so I kept emphasizing the importance of the subjective experience in humans, but really talking about the behavioral responses in other animals. And the field of emotion, kind of, it wasn't just me that was involved, but my work had a big part in kind of getting emotion into neuroscience by doing it through the rigorous way of studying behavior, because neuroscience didn't really think about emotion very much at that time. It was like the Society for Neuroscience was created in the late 1960s. I was starting my research in the mid 1970s. And by the time I was studying the rats, I applied for a grant and to NIH, and the reviewer said, "You can't. The neuroscientists do not study emotions." It was kind of taboo to study emotions, so that's why I kept doing the Pavlovian conditioning stuff. But then at the same time, always putting that second layer about consciousness in the chapters. So, eventually the field kind of took off. There were a bunch of people who got involved, and it became a very thriving area of research. The amygdala was everyone's favorite brain area. It still is. The amygdala, if you used to be able to put in something like that into Google, and it would tell you how many hits it got. It doesn't really do that anymore. But when I did it, it had millions of hits about the amygdala and emotion. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. And so it became a real thing. It's not just in science, but also a cultural meme. Everybody knows the amygdala, really. You see it on TV, it's in movies. And so the more I thought about it, the more I felt it was the wrong idea, that the amygdala was important for detecting and responding to danger in rats and people. But that didn't mean that the experience of emotion was also in the amygdala, but many, many scientists did and still do talk about the amygdala as a fear center. So I got into a little bit of trouble with my colleagues, because I started saying that the amygdala is not a fear center. It's a threat detector, and it allows the organism to stay alive in danger. If you think about the history of danger, it goes all the way back to the beginning of life. So, for example, the first bacterial cell that ever lived long enough to divide in half and create the next bacterial cell had to do two important things. One, it had to be able to detect danger. In other words, is the environment they're in, is that toxic or safe? And they had to do that. But it wasn't the bacteria saying, "Oh, I bet that's scary." No, that's not what happened. Bacterial cells couldn't do that. they were able to build, they had a built-in way of detecting on their surface, the cell surface, what was happening in the environment around them, and could reject any toxicity by moving away. And at the same time, it had to acquire nutrients, and it would have to move towards nutrients in order to stay alive. So detecting danger and surviving through having the right kinds of nutrients allowed them to stay alive long enough to split and create the whole history of the rest of life. So if you follow that all the way through, ultimately you get to the amygdala, but the amygdala is more like the bacterial cell. It's not like a psychological area. So for me, the emotion itself is the subjective experience that you have, the feeling of fear that you have. And that's a separate process, separate and parallel. But because we tend to think, well, I'm running, as William James said, I'm running from the bear, I must be afraid, you know. But the problem is, those are just correlations, right? Because the circuits that control the behavior are not the circuits that give rise to the conscious experience. These are higher cortical circuits in the prefrontal cortex that are able to hold information in mind and working memory. So an emotion is a kind of working memory in a sense. Now, I don't want to go on and on and on with this long question, but basically what I'm saying is that the fact that we are running from the bear and we're afraid doesn't mean that the fear causes the running or that the running causes the fear. It's different things. I mean, James said it was the running that causes the fear, but I think that's even wrong. What causes the fear is your subjective experience, that you as an individual have grown up in a culture. Where were you born?
She was born in India and I was born in the United States.
In where? United States?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So you grew up in one culture, you grew up in a second culture, and within the culture that you grew up in, you were acquiring what the emotion, what the fear is in that culture. Every culture has a word for fear, translating the English word fear into, because every culture has danger. But it's not the fear that is universal. What's universal is danger in life. And so as you go through life, you not only have a culture that you've grown up in a large sense, but you also have a culture you've grown up in a family sense, and a culture that you've grown up in terms of the friends you have. And those are so different. And yet we take one word like fear and we assume that that means the same thing in all those different kinds of situations. So that's to me, what we have to do is think about emotions as experiences that are shaped by what's called schema. These are bodies of knowledge that we acquire as we go through the process of learning who we are. And so you learn what danger is as you go through your life, and you develop a fear schema. If you see something dangerous, you then become afraid through that cognition of fear that is thrown into your conscious mind.
So for our next question, you mentioned terms like emotion, and you talked about this one a lot, and I think you already to some extent defined emotion, but so how would you and other neuroscientists define emotion, and what exactly are emotions from like a scientific perspective?
Well, I have a particular point of view that is not necessarily very widely accepted, but for me, an emotion is a kind of culturally determined. Uh, I can't. I've written this so many times, but I can't quite put it together. But anyway, it's about culture. It's about these schema and how you've grown up with them. It's about what's happening in the environment. In other words, in the presence of danger, you have these automatic amygdala-like responses that cause you to sweat and to freeze and to do all of those things, your heart to race. But that's not the emotion. Those are physiological responses that keep you alive. The emotion is the experience you have of fear, which is totally determined by the experiences you've had all of your life about fear. So even though you two sit together right here and you are from different cultures, are ultimately the same culture, you're from the same background, but you grew up in the U.S. And so yeah, so you have a different perspective on what she has. And that's true not only it's true of every individual. We have a different perspective as we go through life, and our emotions are shaped by who we are. And that's very individualistic. So it's both culturally schematic and individually schematic. So, I can't tell you that. I mean, I'm not going to go through the definition of the emotions that other people have, but mine is that it's all about the subjective experience. The rest of the stuff has nothing to do with well, it has something to do with emotion, but it's secondary. It's like a helping hand of the body physiology and behavior, but the actual experience is not that. The actual experience is the schema that you've applied to that situation.
Thank you. One of your most influential ideas discussed in your work is that the brain's threat detection systems and the conscious feeling of fear, like you mentioned before, aren't necessarily the same thing. So could you explain that distinction a little more for us?
Sure. So, um, do you have pets?
No, she has
Okay. So
no.
let's talk about a dog
Okay.
that uh, has been hit by a car and is on the side of the road. The poor dog is writhing in pain. He's like just he's howling, and what we empathize with that because we feel, how could you not, that he's feeling something that, and but what you see is not his fear. What you see are his reflexes that are making him writhe, making him howl. Um, that's not to say that the dog isn't afraid. He is. But those are different things. The subjective experience of the fear in the dog or in a human is going to be in parallel to those behavioral and physiological responses. So the dog is suffering and feeling things. There's no doubt about that. But the human brain is much more complicated. If you look at the transition from lower mammals to the early primates to more complex primates to apes and other kinds of animals that are closer to us, you have a trajectory of experience that is evolving over time. I think that there's a lot of research now. People are trying to say that that octopuses are conscious, or that all kinds of the bees are conscious and so forth. I I think that that's an overstep because we don't know. It's hard enough to understand what's going on in other humans. That's for sure. But I think we can probably accept that our evolutionary history from from lower mammals to us has a path that is continuous. We have our brain is a mammalian brain, so all mammals have the same basic kind of brain. And so as mammals went from very primitive organisms that had survived the climactic changes that led to the disappearance of dinosaurs, very small mammals didn't need a lot of food because they were so small, and dinosaurs had used so much, and they didn't have enough to eat. So small mammals began to grow, and they got bigger and bigger, and they led to all kinds of other mammals, ultimately to monkeys and other kinds of primates. And so that's our trajectory. There's a clear trajectory from them to us. And so as we extrapolate from what's going on in our brain, we can say that there's very likely, because it's an evolutionary path, that they have some kind of primitive consciousness, rats and mice and dogs and cats. But once you leave the mammals, you begin to have less of a grounding to talk about, say, what's happening in reptiles or fish and so forth. So I'm not saying that reptiles and fish have nothing, but to me, it seems like what we need to do is understand consciousness in mammals first, because we'll never get to the bottom where, if you think about bees or flies, there's no common ancestor that takes us and bees and flies and puts it in the same category. That just doesn't exist. So those are parallel forms of evolution where the organism evolved from something that, there's no connection between what we are and they are. So, my emphasis is to focus on better understanding of mammals rather than to try to go all the way back in evolutionary history. Because I do believe that, if we imagine mammals have all the same basic brain areas we do. All mammals have that. So they all have a kind of medial prefrontal cortex right down the middle of between the two hemispheres. They have well, that's the main thing that's important in terms of consciousness. They have a kind of cortex that allows them to experience something like what we experience, but in a much, much more limited way. But as we get to primates, it's even more elaborate, and you get to great apes, it's even more elaborate. And it's possible that some of the great apes are conscious in very similar ways that we are, because we are in that same category of these great apes. So maybe they are, but there are restrictions, so you can't go in and start picking around in a chimpanzee's brain. It's just against the law because they are so sophisticated and close to us. So, I think we can extrapolate from us the kinds of things that might be in great apes, and the kinds of things that might be in monkeys, and the kinds of things that might be in other mammals. But we have to accept that these are hypotheses or guesses. And the problem is that in the study of animal consciousness, there's often a kind of rigorous belief that because it looks conscious, the animal must be conscious. And I think that that's not right. You should, if you were doing that, I think you should say that it could have that kind of capacity rather than it must. So that's my position on all of this.
So you mentioned we've been talking about fear and emotion, and a lot of people use fear and anxiety interchangeably. So, from a neuroscience perspective, how are they different? And then, how has research on fear, anxiety, and emotions contributed to our understanding on mental health conditions like anxiety disorders or PTSD?
Well, fear is is something that happens in the presence of an immediately existing danger. Whereas anxiety is a concern about what might happen. That's the main difference. So it's you think of anti-anxiety drugs. What you think of, they're often called fear and anxiety drugs. But I think anxiety has to be treated as a different thing, because it's much more of a kind of subjective kind of anticipation, whereas the fear is just an immediate sort of subjective experience about what is there. So the the medications for depression, anxiety, and so forth are kind of limited, especially for depression. Anxiety, it's a little better, but for depression, yeah, with all these medications, they're developed by putting rats or mice into chambers and looking at their behavioral responses at pharmaceutical companies. And if the animal, let's say, if you give the drug to an animal and the animal freezes less, the assumption is that the animal is less fearful. But the fact is that is simply controlling the behavioral and physiological responses. We don't know what the subjective experience of the animal is. So that's why the medications don't really help the subjective experience of people, because animals don't have the same kind of subjective experiences we do. And so you can't change the subjective experience of a patient by giving them a drug that was developed through an animal. Subjective experience is something that is so intuitive, so important to us that I like to think of it as a three-step approach to therapy. One, you tame the amygdala. This is a metaphor, not literally necessarily, because lots of parts of the brain are involved in this. But let's say we tame the amygdala by being able to tone down its ability to detect or to its ability to continually be responsive to a dangerous stimulus. So over time, if you especially in anxiety, you're anticipating the danger all the time. And so by taming the amygdala and other brain areas that are involved in anxiety, you might be able to then start a second wave of approaches, which is to uh, tame or rethink the memories that you have about those kinds of situations, and rethink your understanding of who you are. Let's say because now you're less, let's you say you're spider phobic, and the amygdala has been tamed, so you are less jittery around spiders. And if you can get the patient to the point to be less jittery or less concerned, whatever their problem is, then you can begin to work with their memories because they've identified themselves with the story about who they are. They're an anxious person. They're a fearful person. So that is, they walk around with that idea. So, but the idea, what I'm talking about is a way to break those habits of who you think you are and kind of move to a different position now that you see that you can control some of these behavioral and physiological responses. The next step you would want to do is rethink the subjective experiences. In other words, rethink your narrations about who you are. And then, the last step is to, once the therapist and patient have worked that out, that doesn't mean the patient can say, okay, thank you, doctor, now I'm done. Because you're going to always have some kind of return to this kind of thing, and you have to maintain it over time. And so I think, this is kind of difficult to say, but I think probably the ideal situation would be to have a therapist that you could always be working with, because every time you change the therapist, you're getting a different, thing. But you've worked out something with one therapist, you should stay with that person as long as you can. Now, it's expensive, so it's not like something. I think society needs to come to terms with this, that we have to find ways that we help people, and the cost of insurance, the cost of doing all these things gets higher and higher, and if you don't have health insurance, you can't get help. So, the ideal situation would be that you would have someone that you could go with through, once you've tamed the amygdala and rethought your memories, someone you could always return to and revisit those stories that you don't want to have about yourself. So, but that's never going to happen in the real world. So it's just a hypothesis about what should be done rather than what can be done.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Professor. If our listeners were to take one message away from today's conversation, what would that message be?
The message would be to, when you see something or hear something about the brain, don't accept it automatically. Researchers, get very excited when they discover something, and it becomes like a big deal. But then some other research comes along and maybe has to change it a little bit. So I would say to always have a broad view and be a little skeptical. And you're young, so you can't go to work in a lab and be skeptical of what the professor is doing. But in your mind, be skeptical because you might see things that you couldn't necessarily introduce into the lab you're in. But when you take the next step, maybe you can introduce that idea, that particular kind of insight that you had as you grow up and get your own lab.
And what is one unanswered question about emotion?
Oh, there's so many. It depends on. I have what I consider a pretty thorough understanding, but other people in the field think that's not the answer. But I think that all of my experiences that have led me to the research I've done and to the ideas that I've had started with that one split brain patient that I mentioned at the very beginning, because it was my pleasure to be able to work with this young man and to understand how he was somehow struggling, with what his two half brains are doing. And one of the things that we discovered was that let me put it this way. So my mentor, Mike Gazzaniga, once told me while we were doing all this, he said, well, for 20 years, split brain researchers asked, what did you see? Asked the patient, what did you see? That's flashing pictures on the screen. And then when we found this other patient, the narrative changed. It wasn't, the important question was not what did you see, but why did you do that? So what we saw was that he would, when we would put a picture into his right hemisphere, the left hand would point to a picture a symbol that reflected that picture, and the left hemisphere would then make a story up about why the left hand is pointing there, because the right hand belongs to the left hemisphere. And so the story that in this case, you'd say, why'd you do that? He said, well, I saw, this is much more complicated than I meant to make it, but the patient saw, let me start that over. The patient saw two things, one on the left side of the screen, one on the right side. And when when that happened, each hand pointed to a picture. And so we asked the left hemisphere, why did you do that? And the left hemisphere is looking at his fingers. So he said, well, I saw a chicken claw, and so I pointed to a chicken. So this is the left hemisphere right hand pointing to the chicken. And you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Now, the left hemisphere knew nothing about shovel. The shovel went with a snow scene in the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere didn't see that snow scene. But he assumed that because he saw a chicken and the left hand was pointing to a chicken, it must mean that the reason he's seeing the chicken, the shovel, is because he had seen a chicken. That's so complicated, I'm sorry. But yeah, so if you have any of my papers or something, show those to your audience, because it's too complicated to go into detail here.
We would love to talk more about your theory and about your research on everything if we have more time in the future. But as of right now, unfortunately, we don't have much time left. So Dr. LeDoux, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights and experiences with our listeners. And we truly appreciate your time and your contributions to our understanding of the brain and emotion.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's do it again sometime so I can get that last piece better explained to your audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you so
Thank you very
much
much.
for joining.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
As we wrap up today's episode, we'd like to thank Dr. Joseph LeDoux once again for joining us on MindWaves.
One of the most powerful ideas from today's conversation is that understanding our emotions begins with understanding the brain. Emotions are a fundamental part of being human, influencing how we think, learn, connect with others, and navigate challenges throughout our lives.
By studying the neuroscience of emotion, researchers are helping us better understand mental health, improve treatments for emotional disorders, and gain deeper insight into the experiences that shape who we are.
At NYNO, our mission is to make neuroscience and mental health education more accessible while encouraging curiosity, empathy, and understanding in our communities.
Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow MindWaves and stay tuned for future conversations with researchers, clinicians, advocates, and leaders who are expanding our understanding of the brain and mental health.
Until next time, keep learning, keep listening, and keep exploring.
Thank you.